Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the first of a double bill. We are off into Myanmar or Burma later on with Jack Bauscher talking about what he believes is the most important and amazing combined operations battle of World War II. So that's later on. But right now, we're back to, as you saw in the intro there, to the push into Germany 80 years ago, these very weeks. And to quote Paul Revere, the British are coming. Sure, I'm mixing my wars and enemies there, but the operations into Germany in spring 1945 are often seen as an American-only effort. Well, Christopher returns to the channel to talk about the British 130 Brigade from Gok to Bremen with other places along the way, February to May 1945. So I'll bring him in now. Good morning, Chris. How are you today?
Morning. Very well, thank you. Nice to be here.
And we were just chatting there. This period just does seem to get overlooked a lot. You know, even the memoirs of those who were there, they're just shagged out by this point, aren't they? They're exhausted. The war diary accounts start becoming a bit blunter and briefer, and and I think there's inevitability about it. Everyone just wants to go home. They want to get over this literal and metaphorical hurdle of the Rhine into Germany and bring this godforsaken war off to a halt.
Absolutely. I think the thing that struck me about this, and it struck me about 52, 53 years ago now, I bought a second-hand book, and it was the Rifle Brigade Chronicle, so their regimental journal for 1945. And it was produced after the end of the war to mark 1945. But of course, it begins with several of their battalions fighting in Northwest Europe. It was packed with obituaries of young officers killed after the crossing of the Rhine. There were considerable casualties. It was not, although the final victory was probably a foregone conclusion, how it was going to happen, what state Europe was going to be in at the end of it, and how many of the people fighting for it would still be alive. Yeah. All of those were still big questions. So that's the bit I want to look at today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we've been discussing with John Curatoli yesterday and Monique and Chris. It's that say that the outcome is probably determined, but the exact journey from the beginning of the year to when that victory was going to come is a little bit uncertain. So we're going to begin the presentation. So our folks, as you know, with Christopher, there'll be lots of information coming your way, maps, things like that, and personal stories. And you'll be quoting the words of those who were there. So over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Now, this talk's going to concentrate on British Army's experience, the infantry's experience in the campaign in Northwest Europe in the last 3 months of the Second World War. I shall be looking at one big battle, that's Operation Veritable, which was the clearing of the west bank of the Rhine in February and early March 1945. And then I'll be choosing a handful of battles of varying types and sizes to describe the advance from the Rhine to Bremen and beyond, from late March until the European war ended in early May 1945. I'm going to try and do this with me personally saying as little as possible, by relying on the testimony of a dozen or so men who were there. Now, as these badges up here suggest, all of them were in the 43rd Wessex Division, and there's the Wyvern at the top. That's the badge of the 43rd Wessex Division. Some of them were in the 4th Somerset Light Infantry. There's their cap badge with Jalalabad across the top, which of course rings bells now for anyone with the British or American armies in more recent times. There's the Hampshire badge. The 7th Hampshires were in 130 Brigade, and the Dorset Regiment had 2 battalions in that brigade, the 4th and 5th. So all territorial battalions. I'll be talking about the 4th Somersets my dad was in, but mainly I'll be talking about the 130 Brigade, the 7th Hampshires, and the 4th and 5th Dorsets. My witnesses are going to be drawn from these sources. Now, let's start with the battle that began at Clave on the 12th of February, 1945. This is Operation Veritable, the opening shots of the Operation Veritable. It was a massive battle involving 7 divisions, an attack by Bomber Command, and the largest preliminary artillery barrage in the history of the British Army. How about that? It took place after a thaw and in an area flooded by the retreating Germans. The going was slow, the country was waterlogged, and the roads were jammed with traffic. Biggest traffic jam in the history of the British Army as well. Lots of larger Guinness Book of Records stuff, this battle.
Yeah.
Clave itself was a mass of rubble from a bomber command attack with Lancasters. They used the wrong bombs, and as a consequence, they really impeded the advance, sadly. So the whole of this operation, Veritable, which was going to last more than a month, began, as many battles do, unpromisingly and in complete bloody chaos. After helping the 15th Scottish to complete the capture of Clave, 43rd Wessex Division were poised to advance southeast with the flooded Rhine on their left and the Siegfried Line defences on their right. So they're going down behind some of these Siegfried Line defences. If you look at that red line on the map coming down from Clave, first of all to Bedburg there, and then it goes on round a bit of Reichswald Forest and down, turning southwest towards Goch. And Goch was going to be a bloody battle that they would have to fight. This was not going to be an easy advance. Now, I'm going to start with people who I knew and loved, men who became my friends. They were in my father's platoon. And here's one of them. This is Doug Proctor. And so we're going to start with a little bit from his book. And not a lot of people know about that because it was produced purely for the use of Sandhurst. But it gives a section commander's, a very good section commander's view of the battle or the campaign from Normandy right through to this battle we're talking about now. And he was very direct and positive and quite self-confident and a very, very experienced section commander. And this is what he wrote about the beginning, having broken through Clave, the beginning of that advance, that first advance down towards Bedburg, because that was my father's company's objective, the wood at Bedburg. At Platoon O Group, Lieutenant Jary informed us we were to lead the battalion in the attack. Our haversacks were to be carried in our company truck, so for once we'd be fighting as light infantrymen should fight, unencumbered by excess weight and at speed. Owen Cheeseman, that's the next picture, if you will, Paul. Here's another corporal in 18 Platoon, Corporal Owen Cheeseman from London. And Owen Cheeseman, led with his section in single file, followed by me and Jim Kingston brought up the rear. The opposition was light. In fact, it was almost non-existent. Our only anxiety was caused by enemy snipers in the woods to the north of the road. Owen pushed on for about 1.5 miles. This is quite a remarkable achievement. This was the average advance. This was a few hundred yards. So this is good going. Suddenly, he came under fire from a small hotel on the right side of a road junction and from a farmstead on the left. His section immediately went to ground to provide covering fire for Jim and myself with our respective sections to attack the hotel and the farm. Lieutenant Jary joined my section to attack the farm from where we had been fired on by a Spandau. Leaving Dobson to shoot us in with the Bren, I led the rest of my section in a frontal charge. The German Spandau team made good their escape and could be seen 200 yards away running towards Bedburg. We helped them on their way with a fusillade of rapidly aimed shots. And here's Jim Kingston, the next picture. This is the chap who's the third section commander at this time, later became platoon sergeant. This is back to Doug now. Dashing across the road, I entered the hotel to assist Jim in the search of its many rooms. A few Germans had been captured and were under guard. Among them was a medical orderly. Remember that. I went along the corridor to see if Jim needed any help. Suddenly, a body came hurtling down the stairs. It was Jim, who'd missed his footing. His Sten gun hit the floor with a resounding smack. I was the only one in the corridor, and the bullet, discharged by the Sten's concussion on the floor, hit me dead center in the groin. I couldn't quite take in what had happened. It was all so sudden, so completely unexpected and accidental. The battle must go on. The platoon continued towards Bedburg. Jim was to leave me. In a fit of rage and disgust, he hurled his Sten away. I believe he carried mine instead. The person who attended me was Corporal Alec Douglas of the reserve platoon, who enlisted the help of the German medical orderly. Now this is me talking. Placed on a carrier and attended by the German orderly, Doug was driven out of the battle. When they quickly hit a traffic jam, Sergeant Tommy Handley of the 4th Somersets stood on the bank of the road and went berserk, clearing a way through so his friend could be got back to the regimental aid post. Meanwhile, the German orderly stuck closer than a brother. When they drove through a mortar stonk, he covered Doug with his own body. Doug remembered, after the RAP, I was put in an ambulance, and surprisingly, the German orderly came with me. We seemed like old friends now. We conversed in smatterings of English and German, fractured maybe, but understandable and in some way a comfort. I like to think the German felt the same. I certainly owed him a great debt. Now, if we come on a couple, you'll find a picture of my dad. There he is. Recognize the eyebrows. Right. Meanwhile, 18 Platoon continued their advance, and my father wrote, Sergeant Kingston's section now led at a cracking pace. We'd by now advanced 2 miles without armoured or artillery support. In the distance, I could see Bedburg Hospital Wood, which was D Company's objective. 200 yards short of the wood, a railway track ran across our front with a level crossing on the road, and here it is. There's the level crossing. We're looking from behind the German positions up the road down which 18 Platoon are advancing towards us. So there's the railway crossing between us and them. The real road is the one that looks like a cycle track now. The one on the left is a modern road was put in post-war. This is the road they advanced down. Back to my father. Fearing that the retreating parachute troops would make a stand on the edge of the wood, I increased the rate of advance, joining Lance Corporal Porteous in the forward section. Running across the level crossing, I suddenly found myself face to face with a German platoon, complete with MG-34, a Spandau. Fortunately, the gun was mounted on a tripod, which was unusual, and it couldn't be traversed in our direction. From a drainage channel on the left of the road, so that's the right here, by those bushes just beyond the railway crossing there's still a dip there. A parachutist leapt up and swathed in a camouflage veil. Pointing his Schmeiser at me, from about 10 yards range, he fired a whole magazine of about 30 rounds. It was like watching a slow-running, silent movie. I didn't hear the chatter. A stream of empty cartridge cases fly from the German gun. Miracles do indeed happen. One 9mm bullet went through my beret, missing my head literally by a hair's width. Another went under the epaulette of my jacket, penetrating the webbing cross brace of my equipment and grazing my shoulder. A third bullet ricocheted off the surface of the road and disintegrated, the jacket finally lodging in the palm of my right hand. Then came the anticlimax. The German looked at me in amazement, threw away his Schmeiser, and with a shrug of the shoulders, surrendered. My natural elation was short-lived. Behind me lay Lance Corporal Porteous, shot through the heart. Now, I grew up with the story of Lance Corporal Porteous, and when I went to Bedburg in 1981 and took this picture, I went on to the Reichswald Forest War Cemetery and visited his grave and took a picture for my father. But when I was writing So Red a Road in 2022, I decided that I'd like to know a bit more about Porteous, and I found his son, John. And he sent me this picture of him. And there he is. That's Lance Corporal Porteous. And I discovered something quite extraordinary about him. Nobody knew him very well because he'd only recently joined the battalion. But this man actually, although he was from Durham, was working before the war as a barber in Southampton. And so he enlisted in the Hampshire Regiment. And he was one of the men who landed with the 1st Battalion of the Hampshire Regiment at 7:30 in the morning on D-Day at Arromanches.
Mm.
So he had gone through all that until 50 Div was sent home. And then he happened to be posted to 18 Platoon, which, as we know, was commanded by a Hampshire officer on loan to the Somerset Light Infantry, my dad. So we know a little bit more about Porteous, and he was a brave man. He followed my father onto that railway crossing, and it cost him his young life.
Now, that little story, I mean, a tragic story of his death, but the fact the Germans surrendered immediately after firing kind of encapsulates exactly what this period is all about, isn't it? That you just don't know. Is that little crossroads ahead going to see an epic battle that costs the lives of your buddies, or are you going to stroll through and Germans come out with white flags and hands in the air and you just stop and have a cocoa? There's no. It could be either, or it could be kind of both at the same time. The situation can change immediately, and it's a really fascinating period. Tragic but fascinating.
I think that's absolutely true. And of course, they were fighting Fallschirmjäger who knew what they were doing.
Yeah.
And they were not going to give in easily. If it looked as though it was going well tactically, they would fight on.
Yeah. But everyone's pragmatic by this point. Okay, there's the odd green person on both sides, doesn't know what they're doing, but people kind of have learned when to use a playing cards analogy, when to twist and when to stick, and that's what's happening in these. The Germans, okay, well, we're not going to win now. Let's either fall back or surrender. They know exactly when that moment would be.
And that was the thing my father wrote about. That surprised me. Actually, he said the German defense would sometimes just melt away, and they were very good at doing that. They would just disappear. Yeah. He said one thing they used to do immediately before sometimes was bring down quite an artillery or mortar stonk.
Yeah.
And if that happened, you knew, or you thought there was a good chance they'd be pulling out very shortly. But they were. I mean, they had been practicing retreats since Sicily, and they were very, very good at them.
Yeah, they're good at it. They're ordered fighting withdrawals, a trit to the enemy. That's the best they can hope for now, is they can't win, but they can just keep killing allies in higher numbers and maybe get better terms for surrender. I don't know, but but maybe their rationale. But moving on, fantastic stuff as always.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, if we could go, here's the map again. We've now come down to Bedburg, and the 4th Somersets are ensconced in Bedburg. There's now a pause while they sort out the start line for a new attack and decide who's going to lead it. Remember, all this is flooded. All this stuff has to be brought up behind them across very, very difficult ground. So it does take a little while. Finally, on the 15th of February, supported by the 13th, 18th Hussars and a lot of artillery, the 4th Dorsets were chosen to attack down the road. And so their job was to get down round that bit of the Reichswald forest there and down towards Goch. And the man who was going to lead them was Major Joe Simmons, who came from just up the road from here. And he was a young pre-war surveyor who'd been a territorial and commanded a platoon here, but now had found himself commanding a company. He was wounded on Hill 112. Commanding his company. He came back at the end of the year. So he's recently rejoined them. And here he is commanding a company. Now, this is what he said about this advance, which was a stunning achievement. While I was recceing the start line with the other company commanders, we noticed German airburst shells registering overhead. And my batman, Private Daniels, suggested that we meet the company and form them up a little to the left and rear of the newly chosen place where there was a German trench system. This I did, very fortunately, as when the company arrived, we were treated to a most tremendous shelling, which could only have been the result of observed fire. The enemy of some high ground and houses, which we'd understood were clear. I had never, before or since, been the object of such concentrated shelling. The result was that we were about 10 minutes late getting underway. I love that. worst barrage ever. So we were 10 minutes late getting underway, which we did at 10 o'clock. Number 2 platoon under Lieutenant Girardot, a French-Canadian officer, was leading my company and came under heavy small arms fire from the houses and gardens on the high ground. Girardot was wounded and Sergeant Walter Gregory killed. After locating the enemy positions with some difficulty, I launched an attack with number 1 platoon under Lieutenant Pope. Number 3 platoon had somewhat got broken up by enemy defensive fire and couldn't be got into this attack, so the remaining members supported number 1 platoon's assault with 2-inch mortar smoke and small arms fire. My forward observation officer fired a concentration on the objective, but although it was accurate, it was not as heavy as he was usually able to produce, because we had a shortage of ammunition caused by the flooded lines of communication. Number 1 platoon assaulted with splendid courage, but was badly shot up on approaching the enemy positions by the German paratroopers, who were dug in the cellars of the houses and were firing from ground level, and had consequently not been much battered by our 25-pounder concentration. By this time, we'd been able to get a troop of Shermans up, which had previously been unable to get along with us owing to the wet state of the ground. So I launched another assault on the enemy positions with the available members of number 3 platoon and of such remaining members of numbers 1 and 2 as it was possible to gather up. This assault by 3 Shermans went well, and the Germans ran out of the rear of the houses as we rushed in through the front gardens. We were able to shoot down a good many of them as they withdrew across the open fields beyond. C Company on our right met equally stiff opposition and had to fight very hard to capture the houses on the high ground to their immediate front. Neither of us had yet reached our allotted objectives, but we did overcome the enemy and capture his principal positions, and the remainder of the Germans withdrew. As both my officers were badly wounded and my company much depleted, I consolidated on the captured ground at about 12:20. So it's a 2.5-hour battle, this one. From the approach of the battalion to the forming up place until the Germans had been dislodged from the houses on the high ground, they treated us to almost continuous shelling and mortaring, at times so heavy that it was virtually impossible to count the shells falling, all of which made the attack very difficult. The men behaved magnificently throughout, and there were many cases of exceptional calmness and bravery among them. Now, this is what Bill Roberts, this is the commanding officer of the 4th Dorsets, so Joe Simmons's boss. Can we have the next picture? There we are. There he is getting his bar to his DSO from Monty a bit later on. And you can see his wyvern on his shoulder. Now, he was a pre-war Somerset Light Infantry territorial officer, and he did spectacularly well, and he was a very good commanding officer. And what he said about Joe's attack was it was the toughest day experienced by the 4th Dorsets throughout my period of command. It was estimated that the enemy had well over 300 guns in support of this sector, and we seemed to be the target of most of them. I was amazed that the advance continued in the early stages as steadily as it did. I shall always carry a vivid picture of Major Simmons standing up, blowing his whistle, and bowling his steel helmet in the direction of the Germans. A Company appreciated this typical gesture by its commander and followed him to a man. A and C Companies soon met some very tough opposition from German paratroops forming part of Battle Group Hutzer, the officer who had succeeded van der Heide after his capture during the Ardennes offensive. A Company finally took its objective. With grim and unrelenting determination, it finally took that hill, giving no quarter and pursuing and killing more of the enemy who decided to run. Returning in a tank from this pursuit, Joe Simmons was seriously burnt when the tank received a direct hit from an 88mm gun and brewed up at once. With his usual thoroughness, however, he reorganized the remnants of his company and was finally evacuated in great pain. Now, the chap who was the battalion signal sergeant, the Wally Keynes here, has just been commissioned, and there he is looking very smart in his new uniform. So newly commissioned Second Lieutenant Wally Keynes.
Fair, probably someone else's. If he was newly commissioned, that's probably not from the tailor. That's from someone else who bought it, I expect, isn't it?
A good fit though, didn't it?
Good fit, yeah. Taylor. Someone's holding it at the back. Bulldog clips at the back for the photo. Yeah.
He recorded that A Company alone had lost 24 killed and a great many wounded. I was wireless operating in a scout car with Captain Richards, the adjutant. Shells continuously rained down all round us, and shrapnel hit the scout car's armour like bullets ricocheting off boulders. The attack carried on till about 1 o'clock. The colonel sent me to brigade headquarters for further instructions and to put the brigadier in the picture. But the German resistance now was on the wane, and the 4th Somersets and 214 Brigade made progress beyond Bedburg down to Goch and up onto the escarpment. Now, a personal... At the end of the whole campaign, in a letter of thanks to the 43rd Wessex Division, Brian Horrocks wrote, "I doubt whether any other division has had so much hard fighting during the campaign and has been so uniformly successful. Of all your triumphs, the greatest, I am certain, was the famous advance from Clave to the escarpment north of Goch. This was a bitterly contested action, and it was the turning point in Operation Veritable." So 3 years ago, when I was writing So Red a Road, I was in the pub in Shaftesbury having lunch with James Simmons, Joe's son, and I read him this part of Horrocks' letter, and it gave us quite a kick to realise between them, our dads had begun and led that bit that Horrocks was talking about here.
As we've been discussing with other presenters this week, it's despite the losses, there's a real professionalism among these units now. They really do know what they're doing now. This isn't some of the naive first steps taken by some of these units, not specifically talking about anyone there in Sicily or in North Africa or early part of Norway. This is well-honed, well-oiled machines essentially now that know what they're doing. And yes, there's going to be surprises and there's going to be things that don't go your way, but they're falling back on this inherent ability to get the job done.
Yes, I mean, if you didn't know how to do it by now, you'd be dead.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
So yes, you're right. You knew what risks you could take, I suspect. Right. Now, very bad impression of Montgomery. This is the order he put out when we started on this, the Rhine crossing. "Having crossed the Rhine, we will crack about in the plains of northern Germany, chasing the enemy from pillar to post. The swifter and more energetic our action, the sooner the war will be over. And that is what we all desire, to get on with the job and finish off the German war as soon as possible. Over the River Rhine, then, let us go. And good hunting to you all on the other side. May the Lord mighty in battle give us the victory." Now, that highly characteristic, very bad impression, but
it was pretty good. I was impressed.
But the highly characteristic message before the Rhine crossing described exactly what was going to happen, actually, once that bridgehead had been established on the east bank. The German defense was losing cohesion. That cohesion had largely been spent in the fierce battles on the west bank of the Rhine that we've just been talking about. Yeah. Many of their soldiers retained their tactical nous, and of course they had a patriotic determination to defend their homeland. So Monty's 21st Army Group would make some rapid advances, but some very nasty little battles would result in, especially among their junior leaders, section, platoon, troop, company, and squadron commanders. In each advance to contact, and that's what was going to happen now, a series of advances to contact, mines would exact a heavy toll, while the first scout car, armored car, tank, or infantryman to bump into opposition would seldom survive the encounter. Very sad. Last minute high price to pay. Every advance then was a nerve-wracking business. In some places, the Germans would fight like wildcats, exacting a high price in blood. In others, they'd put up token resistance and then slip away to fight another day. In other places still, they weren't there at all. And you didn't know what you were going to find until the first shot or shell or mortar bomb or mine went off. So let's just have a look at the route we're going to be talking about here. They cross the Rhine down in the bottom left-hand corner there at Ries, and they move up through the bridgehead that has already been formed for them by the Scots, and they get round the Twente Canal and on up past out of Holland, around about Hengelo, Borne, that sort of area where the border is, and then on into Germany. And we'll be coming to Cloppenburg, which was a beastly battle, and Bremen. And then finally, they did a little, beyond Bremen, they did a little push up towards Bremerhaven in the last few days of the war. So that's the bit that we're going to be talking about now. There's loads to talk about if we want to, but what I'm going to do is just pick out things that I think are good examples of the experience of infantrymen. And we'll start with a reasonably peaceful scene, because here we are on the banks of the Rhine. That's the 5th Dorsets, and they are loading onto their buffaloes to go across the Rhine. And there they are on board, chugging across to the far side. It's much wider than it usually is because it's been flooded by the Germans. So, the Scots have already gone across. They went across at 2100 on the 23rd of March. The 7th Black Watch and the 7th Argylls led 51st Highland, established a bridgehead, followed by the 15th Scottish, a couple of American divisions, and so on. Airborne then landing on the 24th. And by the time the 5th Dorsets had crossed, there was an established bridgehead. On their arrival over the Rhine, the 4th Dorsets, with D Company of the 7th Hampshires under command and supported by a squadron of the 13th, 18th Hussars. The next one should be a picture of Wally Keynes, actually.
No.
No, that's the one afterwards, is it?
Hang on. No. Yeah, that's what we got. Then we're going back to, those ones again.
Keynes should repeat. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. We'll carry on.
Okay. Or is he glasses? Has he got glasses on?
We'll have him anyway. Because it's okay. So he described the beginning of the battle to take Millingen, which is just a town within the bridgehead. They're trying to break out beyond it. And the 4th Dorsets, supported by a squadron of the 13th, 18th Hussars, were ordered to capture it. Not a simple operation, because the approach to the village demanded a 90-degree wheel by the attacking force. And then shortly before the assault, Bill Roberts, the colonel, discovered that the battalion that had attacked previously hadn't properly cleared the start line. So dashing forward under heavy shell fire, he had to do a personal reconnaissance and adjust his orders. So not an ideal start to a battle. But Wally Keynes here remembered the beginning of the battle. Typhoons came down from the heavens above and fired rockets onto the village. And at the same time, 25-pounders plastered the place with shells and more smoke, covering our movements and allowing us to get closer to the objective. Guns were firing shells onto the village on the left and right flanks, but as soon as the guns stopped firing, their deadly explosives onto the objective and lifted onto the villages further on, the enemy decided to send over a few shells onto the column advancing up the main road. Of course, this made us all duck, and the only cover we could find was a muddy ditch, which the majority used as shelter. Jary had well estimated our movements and knew where we were. A Company were now entering the village, and what with the guns blazing away, there was smoke and flames all over the village. Joe Simmons had returned from his burns, where he was burnt at the end. There he is, burnt at the end of the battle above Goch there, and within 5 weeks he was back in charge, in command of his company again. So he led A Company to seize the bridge and approaches to Millingen. By 1810, his men had established a bridgehead beyond the Millingen Mere river, and by that time they were in the village. By 2 o'clock, they were in the village itself. But the defenders didn't give up easily. So let's just look at what this meant for some of Joe's men who were now entering that village to clear it. Here is a military medal citation for Sergeant Frank Stretch, and there should be a picture of him. There he is, actually getting his military medal from you-know-who. It was dark when Sergeant Stretch led his section into a large house. One man went forward to cover the entrance hall. A German, concealed in an alcove at the top of the cellar stairs, allowed the first man to pass and then leapt out, attempting to bayonet Sergeant Stretch, who immediately shot him dead. Realizing that there were probably more enemy in the house, Sergeant Stretch immediately rushed down the cellar stairs alone, shooting at and wounding 2 enemy who were guarding the entrance. Firing his Sten gun into the cellar, he called upon the others to surrender, whereupon 27 Germans came out with their hands up, although fully armed with 2 Spandaus, 2 Schmeisers, and over 20 rifles. Thus, this NCO, by his initiative, bold action, and complete disregard for danger, single-handedly killed 1 German, wounded 2, and took a further 27 Germans prisoner. With no fatal casualties and only a handful of wounded, the 4th Dorsets had taken 190 prisoners. They were now able to advance further towards Anhalt and Landford. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the attack on Landford. So if we could move on. Yep. Now, this chap, who doesn't look a bit like a soldier, wasn't a soldier at all, really. But he had to be one because of his age. Geoffrey Picot wrote rather a good book about it. He was
Brilliant book. Yeah, lovely book. Yeah.
He was a Hampshire officer. He'd served in the 1st Battalion. He wasn't with them on D-Day. He was left out of battle for that. But he landed a couple of days later and served right the way through. At the end, when 50 Div was sent back to the UK, Geoffrey was moved to the 7th Battalion of the Hampshires. I know he's badged as a gunner here, but that was much earlier. But he was moved to the 7th Battalion of the Hampshires. And this was his first battle with them. And I think this is one of the best descriptions of a battle I have ever read. Landfort was his first battle leading this new platoon. The platoon had to move across 1,000 yards of open country to capture a large farmhouse on the bank of a canal. Now, listen to this description. It's in his words, and it reads like a poem, I think. I'm going to have a swig of water just to...
No problem.
Right. To help us on our way, we're to have a rolling barrage of artillery fire moving forward at a predetermined speed, about 100 yards every minute. The barrage will make the enemy cower at the bottom of their slit trenches or in the cellars of their buildings. If we arrive at these positions the instant the barrage lifts, we can kill or capture them all. But if the enemy spring to their firing positions before we get there, they will be able to mow us down mercilessly. Everything depends on our keeping up with the charge we've been taught in training. It's better to risk casualties from the occasional shell from your own side falling short than to allow the enemy a few seconds to recover. I place a section of men in front in line abreast. I follow immediately behind with the other 25 members of my platoon strung out behind me. The barrage starts and we move with it. For 10 minutes, I don't stop shouting. Keep up the pace. Don't slacken. Keep up the pace. Keep up. Don't stop. Keep up. A soldier complains, there's a Spandau firing at us from over there on the right. I'd better take it on. No, I yell. Don't stop for anything. Fire the Bren back at him from the hip if you like, but keep moving. Throw a smoke grenade if you like, but keep up. Keep moving. Keep up. Don't stop. Another soldier reports, 2 wounded enemy here, sir. We can't leave them. I reply, yes, we can. Leave them. Leave everything. Just keep up with the barrage. That's all we've got to do. Keep up. Keep up. Don't lose the barrage. It might be dangerous to leave them, the soldier persists. Shut up, I bellow. Don't stop. Keep up. Keep up. There's plenty of shells landing everywhere. I'm not surprised there's some wounded. One of my men reports, "There's movement on our left, sir. Fire as you go with anything you've got," I reply, "but don't stop. Keep up, keep up. Faster, faster, keep up." I see a salvo of shells fall round our objective. A few seconds later, Corporal Daly, a regular soldier who is commanding my leading section, enters through the front door of the house, and I go in through the side door. And here's the house.
Hang on. Yep.
There's the house. We've got there without being seriously impeded at any stage of our 1,000-yard advance. Daly stands at the top of a flight of stairs leading to a cellar or basement. In his hand is a grenade. He's wondering whether to throw it into the cellar in case there are any Germans there. He decides not to. But in any case, in case there is anybody, he orders in his best pidgin German, "Kommen Sie up!" There is a pause of a couple of seconds. Then up comes a German soldier holding a machine gun in front of him and surrendering. Daly passes him along to me. I take the gun from him and push him into a room. Daly tries his luck again. "Kommen Sie up!" he shouts. And up comes a second enemy soldier, also armed, also surrendering. He hands his weapon to me and moves into the room indicated. "Kommen Sie up!" orders Daly again. A third German comes up, then a fourth and a fifth and a sixth, until there are 13 of them. If we hadn't leaned on the barrage, if we'd given them time to recover their nerve, they could have decimated my platoon as we crossed the open ground. Instead, we have 13 prisoners, and there are a number of enemy wounded and possibly dead in the surrounding fields, and we have suffered no casualties. I have one more personal duty, to crawl forward about 50 yards to check that the bridge over the canal hasn't been blown up. It hasn't. It was a textbook attack. I never did better, neither before nor after.
Wow. Wow. Yeah,
Really,
brilliant.
It really brings it to life, doesn't it?
It does. Absolutely. Fantastic stuff.
I take my hat off to him as a writer.
Mm.
3 days later, on the 30th of March, the 4th Somersets were advancing to contact towards the village of Sinderen, just a bit further north. And here you'll find another picture of my dad. There we are. He was leading the advance. And what he wrote about this was this. Our advance was to take us along a straight road, bare except for one house on its right-hand side and about 800 yards short of the village. There's the house. And there's the road they're coming along. So we're heading towards Sinderen if we go straight across the fields, diagonally between the house and the road. D Company led the battalion with 18 platoon forward. We had a troop of Sherman tanks under command, which followed my platoon along the road. It was a dry day, and we advanced quickly to within 100 yards of the lone house. For no good reason, the leading Sherman suddenly moved forward of our leading section and halted beside the house. It had barely stopped when I saw it shudder and a small cloud of dust arose from it. A second later, I heard a resounding metallic clang and the whip crack of a high-velocity gun. As we rushed forward to surround the house, the Sherman's crew bailed out, shaken but unharmed. 2 MG-42s, Spandaus, opened fire, sending long bursts high over our heads, a sure sign of inexperience. Taking up position round the house, the platoon went to ground and followed its usual drill. In an advance to contact, when 18 platoon came under fire, even if the enemy was unlocated, our Bren gunners fired 1 magazine in their general direction. Each rifleman also fired 5 rounds rapid. My idea, I considered it good for our morale, and it showed the enemy that we were aggressive. It also gave me time to think. I surveyed our front through my binoculars. At first I could see nothing, but a haystack to our right front interested me. It seemed to be moving slightly. Suddenly it fell apart, and a German Mark IV self-propelled gun drove away from it with some soldiers hanging on top. One of our Bren gunners immediately poured bursts of fire at this tempting target. This was taken up by our second Bren, but the third gun, being behind the house, couldn't engage. The self-propelled gun, which had obviously got away, its passengers did not. After this little episode, I thought it time that I told Freddie, who was 300 yards behind, this is his company commander, what had occurred. I was briefing my runner, Private Thomas, and here's Joe Thomas. There we are. I was briefing my runner, Private Thomas, behind the house when I heard the cry, "Sir, they're charging us." Sure enough, from about 150 yards ahead, a well spread out line of about 20 Germans were putting in a bayonet charge. Brave lads, they didn't stand a chance. I gave no order except cease fire. No one within 70 yards of us. A few minutes later, a procession of Germans with stretchers and a huge Red Cross flag emerged from the village behind. When they were close to their casualties, they hesitated, so I stood up and waved them on. All were unarmed stretcher bearers, and they moved across our front, collecting their dead and wounded. When they'd finished their task of mercy, one of them, I think he must have been the German medical officer, turned and saluted in our direction. I returned the salute, and with that gesture, the tiny Battle of Sinderen ended. Now we're looking towards breaking out of the bridgehead further and further and across the border into Germany. Some of the last Dutch towns to be liberated were Hengelo and Borne near Enschede. So we just look at those. We have quite a lot of pictures for this, so we'll run through those fairly quickly. Now came the breakout from the Rhine bridgehead and the chance to crack about, in Monty's terms. So having bypassed the Twente Canal without having to attack it, Brian Horrocks was in his enthusiastic element, conducting a chase of this kind. Sending the 3rd Division onwards towards the Dortmund-Ems Canal, he ordered 43rd Wessex Division to liberate Hengelo, capture it. 130 Brigade set off on a long approach march starting at midnight in torrential rain. This enabled the brigade to assemble at Enschede and for Speedy Breeden's 5th Dorsets to start their attack to capture Hengelo at 0900 on the 3rd of April. So that's when the battle was going to start. At the same time, Dennis Talbot's 7th Hampshires would skirt the town on its west side and attack from the northwest. And this is interesting because you have 2 different battalions attacking Hengelo from different places, and their experience is utterly, utterly different. The 5th Dorsets have a real battle on their hands. The 7th Hampshires have a triumphant procession being welcomed by the Dutch civilian population. And Hampshires, because they were being welcomed and photographed, and we have no pictures at all of the Dorsets, who were fighting a nasty battle at this point. On the way into Hengelo, a troop of tanks supporting the 5th Dorsets were held up by a string of telemines across the road. And if we could just have a look at the next picture. There we are. Here we have 2 heroes of the 5th Dorsets. On the right, in the forage cap, is Lance Corporal John Holt. On the left-hand side, receiving his MM from Monty, is Corporal George Rudd. So let's just look at what they did as they were to enable the 5th Dorsets to get into Hengelo. So this troop of tanks were held up by a string of telemines, and the whole area was under small arms fire from several enemy positions. Corporal Holt, on the right there, crawled forward, ignored all the shots being fired at him and grenades being thrown at him, and managed to remove 4 mines, creating a gap, enabling the tanks to move ahead. Later on, when C Company led the Dorset attack, which was met by rifle and Spandau fire, Corporal Rudd's section, it's the other chap in the picture here, was point in the very front of the attack, right up at the front. So ordering his second in command to throw a grenade at the Spandau post and his Bren gunner to cover him, he rushed the machine gun team, knocked the Spandau aside, killed the gunner and captured 3 other Germans. So that was their experience getting into the town. In the center of the town, D Company captured a factory which was later found to be manufacturing a secret anti-aircraft predictor for the Luftwaffe. and they cleared the German defences south of the town and finally took the southwest of Hengelo. More than 100 prisoners were taken at a cost in fatal casualties of only 3 men. So this was a lucky day for them, and a wonderful one, of course, for the people of Hengelo. So if we move on, we can see them celebrating a bit. These are the Hampshires approaching, and you told you it was a wet day. So you've got their carriers and jeep and a Sherman, I think, from 13th, 18th Hussars. A white scout car there, and look at that mud, not very nice to march. A bit more in the next picture with some Hampshires trying to work their way through it. You can see they're not being shot at. This is just an approach to a town. And next one. There we are. There's a Hampshire officer looking suitably fierce, but actually nobody's firing at him at the moment. And this is them advancing into Hengelo. Pictures being taken by the Dutch.
And they're wearing Dennison's smocks as well.
Yeah, absolutely. By now they're wearing these. My father was certainly wearing one at Bedburg because he had the hole in the shoulder. We had it. It's the National Army Museum. So they were coming here, and here we are. This was the welcome that the Hampshires got in Hengelo, rather different from the Dorsets who met the Germans coming in.
Yeah.
Keep on going, if you will.
Yeah.
Here are some of the prisoners that they rounded up, Luftwaffe in this case. And down here, next one, we've got David Rooke, who was the second in command of the 7th Hampshires, interrogating some of the recent prisoners. So Hengelo was a huge success. They then moved on to the next town, which was Borne, and they realized the Germans weren't going to fight for it. And the 4th Dorsets took this. That's the 4th Dorsets going in. Now we can take pictures because there aren't any Germans shooting at us. And that's rather a good one. But Bill Roberts used his wits and saved the town, because they were due for an artillery barrage. And when he realized the Germans weren't there, he managed to call it off. So the people of Borne were so grateful that they put Bill Roberts in a cart, and they paraded him around the town, and everybody said thank you. It was liberated at no cost whatsoever, and there they are doing just that. Now, if you move on, you'll see the Dorsets, and there they are. They're all wearing Dennison smocks too. Yeah. They can't wear berries though, can they? Just look at
general service caps. They're impossible to make them look good. I mean, they're a shapeless lump of serge, aren't they? You just have to go for a jaunty angle and hope that you get away with it somehow. And they've all gone for different levels of 45 degrees up to, depending on how much hair cream you've got to keep it stuck on, I guess, how sticky your brill cream is.
But they now had a couple of days at Borne, and this is them relaxing. And in the next one, you'll see they're meeting some Dutch children. And these again are 4th Dorsets with Dutch children. But the relationship, the friendship then still exists. First of all, the people of Hengelo gave the Dorsets this thing. Can we move on to the next picture?
Hang on. Yeah.
Thank you. That is a memorial scroll from the people of Hengelo to the Dorsetshire Regiment, thanking them for liberating them. The people of Borne called a square there after the Dorsets. Every year at Enschede, a Dutch family, the Konings, place roses on the graves of Corporal Ivan Parkinson and Privates Harry Butler and Clarence Carver of the 5th Dorsets, gave their young lives to buy Hengelo's freedom. So all of this still goes on. And in a couple of weeks' time, my friend Ken Chivers will be going out there with the standards of the Dorset Regiment to go to the annual 3rd of April celebration at Hengelo of the liberation.
Brilliant.
Still goes on. And isn't that lovely? Now, things get nasty, and it's nasty in patches. This is a particularly unpleasant battle, the Battle of Cloppenburg. The place is occupied. Guess who? It's those Fallschirmjäger again. And this is the 129 Brigade actually approaching Cloppenburg on the approach march. As they retreated, the Germans were blowing up bridges and laying mines everywhere. And after Borne, the Hampshires lost Private Stan Brewer when he tried to defuse a mine that had been booby-trapped. So there were all sorts of nasty tricks like that being done. That night, the Royal Artillery shelled the town of Cloppenburg in preparation for the next day's advance. This is the advance. And at 1:15 on Friday, the 13th, ominous, the 4th Dorset pioneer officer, Lieutenant Tom Wharton of the Queen's, was killed by a mine at Nieholt. Later that morning, Robert Hewson, who we met earlier, a company commander in the 5th Dorsets, was wounded when his jeep set off another of these ubiquitous mines. They were everywhere, and people had to be very careful. And even if they were, they sometimes still got blown up. So at 7:45, the Hampshires advanced towards Cloppenburg, where no opposition had been reported. B&D Company in Buffalo armoured personnel carriers drove into the village, supported by 2 troops of Sherwood Rangers tanks. I think that's probably kangaroos rather than buffaloes, isn't it?
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
I think that's an error, you know. I think that's kangaroos. Yeah. So they're supported by two troops of Sherwood Rangers tanks. And of course, James Holland, who we all know, wrote their history. And there's some lovely stories in that, which I've pinched one for this. So 2 loud explosions rang out and the 2 companies were fired on. Leaping from their armoured personnel carriers, the Hampshires tried to get into the village. B Company found the bridge over the river had been blown. When the leading platoon tried to cross, they came under small arms fire, unusually from Panzerfausts being fired like mortars. Heard of before. When he got his platoon across the river, Lieutenant Daniels was drawn into house-to-house fighting on the far bank and pinned down by 2 75mm self-propelled guns firing down the road. Ray Daniels was wounded, killed, but another section commander managed to capture 2 of the houses. The German paratroopers were making Cloppenburg a very hot spot to be in. Captain Terry Leinster, you'll have to forgive the language here, but this is the Sherwood Rangers. I am in no way responsible.
Tankers, eh? Honestly.
Sorry about this. And from Nottingham as well. I mean, the worst sort. Captain Terry Leinster, second in command of the Sherwood Rangers B Squadron, heard one of his tank commanders complaining bitterly on the radio, "Every time I put my loaf out for a bit of a shufty, some fuck-up draws a bead on me. I'm getting right fed up with it." A platoon of B Company was sent with a troop of the Sherwood Rangers tanks to try to locate these 2 75mm guns. And when Harry Sage's tank was hit by a Panzerfaust, he and one of his crew were killed. 2 other troopers were caught by a machine gun in the open and mowed down. So this was the experience of the Sherwood Rangers supporting the Hampshires as they tried to get these 75mm guns. But it wasn't all one way. Lieutenant Freddie Jones's troop found 2 haystacks overlooking the road beyond the town, occupied by the Fallschirmjäger. A gunfight developed with the tanks spraying these haystacks with machine gun fire from their Brownings, while paratroops jumped up from the haystacks trying to hit the tanks with their Panzerfausts. When his Browning ran out of ammunition, Trooper Ernie Leopard hit the final paratrooper with a 17-pounder shell. And of course, the man simply disappeared. As usual, the gunner forward observation teams were well up with the leading infantry, but because the fighting was so close, with Hampshires and Fallschirmjäger and Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry all intermingled, supporting fire couldn't really be safely employed. So instead, they used the Vickers guns of the 8th Middlesex and turned them on the Hampshire's right flank. And it was those that drove off the 75mm self-propelled guns and cleared them. So an unusual use.
Yeah.
Another weapon that played an important part in clearing Cloppenburg is the next thing we're going to see. An AVRE petard with firing a dustbin bomb. It was a grindingly relentless, head-splittingly noisy, desperately destructive battle against a very determined enemy. And this AVRE moved from house to house, pumping dustbin bombs into buildings which either contained or were thought to contain German troops. The fighting,
I can't imagine what that's going to do against the regular house. I mean, as we know, they're designed to knock out bunkers on beaches. So what the hell that I don't know how many, 15 pounds of explosive or something in them. When that hits a house, that's going to be an almighty bang.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. I don't think you'd be walking out of the house.
No.
The fighting in Cloppenburg continued until midnight, when the Germans attacked one of the Hampshire's 6-pounder anti-tank guns and were seen off by a fierce counterattack. I mean, very nasty weapons. The British started using carriers, Wasp carriers, with a flamethrower. One of our heroes, Ginger Pierce, who wrote a book, and there he is. I don't know whether you can see.
Hang on. There we go. Yeah.
That is Sergeant Ginger Pierce of the 4th Dorsets, and his carriers were supporting the Hampshires there. And he wrote, the Hampshire's Wasps had used up all their flame fuel, so while they were reloading, we would carry on with their role. It was the first time I'd seen Wasps in action, let alone been in one when it was flaming. During the street fighting, I never saw any Germans on fire, but a few buildings went up in flames. Close street fighting in a carrier was a dicey business. I'd rather have been on foot, as you can duck in a doorway. The carrier was far too open. Cloppenburg was the Hampshire's last major action. Despite its ferocity, it had cost the 7th Hampshires only 16 wounded and 8 lives. But it brought them 100 prisoners and 5 decorations. It was a fierce battle, nasty one. And now they moved on. The advance continued to Bremen itself. I'm not going to say very much about Bremen. I'm going to read you 2 short pieces at different levels. One is my dad saying what he remembers of it, and the other one is Brigadier Essamy of the 214 Brigade, who I thought gave a very good description of it. It was taken primarily by the 51st Highland Division, but the 43rd Wessex Division did play a part in it. And my father described an attack supported by crocodiles, that's Churchill tanks with flamethrowers again. Flames and thick brown clouds of smoke filled the streets. Grotesque shadows were reflected across the walls of the villas and along the street. Sparks erupted from a blazing jeep knocked out by a Panzerfaust hidden through the gate in a large garden. The opposition were German Marines supported by some Wehrmacht. Spandaus and Schmeissers were fired from upstairs windows and Panzerfaust bombs lobbed over the rooftops. Despite this, another company of the Somersets managed to capture the garrison commander at Bremen, General Sieber, and took his surrender. What the brigadier about it, in the rain which now began to fall, Bremen presented a scene of sordid horror, almost beyond description. Piles of rubble blocked the streets. The twisted lamp standards silhouetted grotesquely against the sky. The stench of buildings still burning offended the nostrils, and the open sewers stank to heaven. The defeated Germans were docile, bewildered, and hopeless. The fighting had released thousands of slave laborers from Eastern Europe and Russian prisoners who broke loose and fell without restraint on the large stores of liquor in the town. Brutal treatment by the Germans had reduced them below the level of beasts. Fighting, rape, and open murder broke out. No one in the division regretted the order to hand over this charnel house, which had once been a great civilized city, to the 52nd Lowland Division, and to move out into the clean air of the Cuxhaven Peninsula on the morning of the 28th. So we're now up at the 28th of April. They've had this horrible glimpse of the destruction of Nazism and all the horrors that that had created. And now they're moving up. The last week of the war, they're doing a rapid advance up towards Tarmstead. I think we should be able to see that if we move on. Yes, if you see here in the inset one, Bremen's down in the middle of the bottom, and there we're going up that road towards Bremerhaven, going north. And all these battles, Wilstead, Tarmstead, Karlsruhe, all of those are places that the little battles took place. I'm not going to focus on them. Just to say, when the 5th Dorsets moved up towards Tarmstead, one of their kangaroos hit a magnetic sea mine. So they were using all sorts of strange, there's a kangaroo, hit a magnetic sea mine. They're using all sorts of strange weapons by this stage, buried in the road between Wilstead and Tarmstead, killing the whole section of about 12 men. A crater of about 30 yards wide was created, and the Royal Engineers had to bridge it. On the 3rd of May, the 7th Hampshires sustained their last fatal casualty when Private Geoffrey Easton was killed by a sniper at Karlshofen. On the 4th of May, Lance Corporal Stan Rickaby of the 5th Dorsets remembered, "We captured Coosted and we dug in by the side of the road, which led out the other side of the town. It was a beautiful day, and it was one when rumours of a complete German surrender were rife. We were in the foremost line of trenches, and our commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Speedy Breeden, DSO-MC, visited us. He came marching down the road, boots highly polished, wearing a soft beret, just as though he was on the barrack square back home in Dorchester. He gave us the latest news, but we were glad to see him go, as we were expecting his presence to attract a barrage of shells and bullets from the enemy trenches on the other side of the valley, only about 400 yards away. I'd often wondered how the war would end, that the bombing of their homeland would persuade the Germans to surrender, but this hadn't eventuated. Even at this late stage, just make a bit of noise or stick your head up, and you would find that was still a war on. We'd survived all the way from the beaches of Arromanches, and we didn't want to spoil our record now." Brian Horrocks was in the loo when he first heard of the German surrender. His historic signal to 30 Corps read, "Germans surrendered unconditionally at 1830. Hostilities on the Second Army fronts will cease at 0800 hours tomorrow, 5th of May. No, repeat, no advance beyond present front lines without further orders from me." Now, here's a characteristic story about General Butch Thomas, whose O group, orders group with his officers, was interrupted by a major with news from the wireless that the war was over. He just said, "I take my orders from the Corps Commander, not the BBC." Well convinced, however, that the war was over, Thomas's verdict on the campaign was succinct. "The troops have done us damn well." They had. Of the 4 battalions we've concentrated on today, their casualties in the last 4 months of the war were remarkably similar. Each lost about 45 to 50 killed and probably another 120 or so wounded. That's the equivalent of about 1.5 of their 4 rifle companies, or 1/3 of their full strength. But they weren't at full strength, of course, for most of the war. So actually, it was probably about 50% casualties they were getting in these.
Wow.
Men.
Yeah, it tells you something.
By that evening, it was over. Montgomery had received the German surrender and the document had been signed. And I'm just going to wave my Dorset flag here because beside Monty, when he took the surrender, is a little chap wearing spectacles. And we haven't got that in the picture. But his name was Derek Nee, and he was a Dorset officer, and he was Monty's interpreter. And his job was to browbeat help Monty to browbeat the Germans into surrendering now. And he did it, age 22. How about that? You'll see him. Everyone would remember how they heard the news of the German surrender. And this is Stan Rickaby, who we heard from earlier, in another guise, because after the war, he played for West Bromwich Albion and did very well in the FA Cup in 1954. And that's him doing just that. And this is what he said. I'm going to end with his words. It was about 8:30 p.m. It was a beautiful evening, still broad daylight, and as always, our section radio operator was fiddling about with his field radio, trying to pick up news, any news, when he suddenly shrieked, "It's over!" As I write this in 1990, I am overcome at the recalling of this memory. Yes, he was sure. It was all quite definite. What just started to arrive from the rear echelon, confirming that Admiral Dönitz, as German commander-in-chief, had surrendered. But the great news was tinged with a warning. Be careful. Watch out for mines. Keep your heads down. Take no chances. Later, when it was dark, headquarters sent us up double rum rations. But as I detest the taste of the stuff, others had triple rations. This was our last night in a slip trench. As the hours slipped by, we didn't even try to sleep. We just talked and talked, illuminated as we were by very lights fired by anyone who had the wherewithal. When did we think we would get home? Various forecasts were made, none of them accurate, for who would have guessed that for me it was to be another 2 years before I would be handing in my kit. I think we assumed that the lads who'd done the fighting would be leaving to others whatever else had to be done. However, none of our deliberations could alter the wonderful feeling of relief that at last the war in Europe was over. In the morning, there was more excitement. Of all the troops along our front, our section of Bren gun carriers had been chosen to escort and guard our enemy's top brass as they took surrender terms to the commander of the German army facing us. Later in the morning, we set off with a cavalcade of jeeps, tanks, and our 3 Bren gun carriers. It was the most exciting and the most interesting journey of my life. And the very last picture, and that's in Bremerhaven a few days later. That is Speedy Breeden, looking very smart, leading the 5th Dorsets in a victory parade. And the gentleman on the dais you'll be able to recognize as the Corps Commander, Sir Brian Horrocks. And that was the end.
Brilliant stuff. Absolutely brilliant stuff. Well, so enthralling, very few questions came in because I don't think they necessarily know what to ask in a show like this. But Dermot Rooney, who gave a fantastic Veritable presentation. Sorry for a dumb question. Has Christopher done the 43 div breakout for Matterborn, How to Gok, Escarpment, February the 13th to 17th? I'm just starting to switch to stitch the diaries and don't want to duplicate. So you haven't done that with it. Well, you've touched. Did you touch on that?
I touched on it at the end of it. It was what followed up. Well,
it was after Dorset Wood, wasn't it?
The 50 up to the 15th, 16th is Joe Simmons.
Yeah.
It was a bit after that I just said they went on and completed the job.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. And the other thing that came up in with the insignia, a couple of questions about the brigade seniority stripes, things like that. So I'll just put up one of the photos you had earlier again. It was number 17, wasn't it? To answer a couple of bits of trivia there, because no, not that one. That one there, because under the wyvern on the shoulder there, folks, are 2 red arm of service strips or brigade seniority strips. So there's a kind of, look it up on the internet, but basically under the wyvern, Royal Artillery would wear a red and blue one, engineers a blue and red one, reconnaissance corps green and yellow, infantry red, and then you have a number of the stripes under the first stripe, which indicate your seniority within the brigade, within the division. That's basically it, isn't it?
That's exactly right. So the 7th Hampshires, the senior regiment, to the Dorsets by 2, the 37th as opposed to the 39th of foot, would have been the first and senior one. So they'd have had one stripe. This is the 4th Dorsets. This is Frank Stretch. So he was a 4th Dorset. He has 2. If you had a 5th Dorset there, he'd have 3.
Yeah. And the other thing is, and I'm not sure whether you're bound to know this, is that the wyverns, the 43rd Wessex badges, are always facing the left. They're not facing pairs. Whereas other units, where it's like the 49th Division and you have a polar bear, you have the one on your left shoulder facing left, pointing forward, the one on your right shoulder facing right, pointing forward. But I've always been told that with mythical beasts, you don't have them facing either way. You only have real animals facing pairs. Is that what you've heard?
I haven't heard anything about it. It's the first time the question's ever been raised. I've never thought about it. I've never
I
noticed.
mean, as with the British Army, there are exceptions to the rule. But if you look at some of the units that are out in Burma, and because the British, we use cats and elephants and pandas, and I'm sure people could be firing with all the other animals we've used. But as I understood it, but I don't know who told me this. Real animals come in facing pairs on divisional patches, but mythical animals, so dragons, wyverns, I can't think of any other mythical animals, centaurs, if we ever use them, would be not in facing pairs. So that's, yeah, it's the British Army and their intricacies and weirdness. It's the tradition, isn't it? But what's your explanation for them not coming in facing pairs? Do you have a different one, or don't you have one?
I have none at all. It's never occurred to me at all.
Okay, well, there you are then. Well, I've given you something to scratch your head about over the next few days and weeks, because it's one of those things I learned collecting badges years ago, that some badges come in facing pairs and some don't. You get the same with collar dogs and things like that. Some collar dogs are the same either side. That's officers or NCOs, smaller versions of the cat badge, folks. So sometimes if it's a horse, they would be facing, so the one on one collar and the other collar kind of facing each other or facing away. But other times they're both facing the same way. So there's lots of exceptions to the rule there. But anyway, it's weird. Pegasus, of course, Pegasus. No, but Pegasus does come in. So that's the exception then. So Pegasus are facing. So are the paras saying Pegasus is a real? I don't.
It's just possible, that you're the first person to have thought of this.
No, because someone definitely told me. But then Pegasus is definitely the exception then, because they are facing pairs. Okay, someone was probably, there's bound to be a website out there about which divisions had facing pairs and which didn't, and there's probably some theory somewhere. Anyway, on that note,
I will mention one thing, if I may. Last night,
do.
I looked out a video, a DVD that I'd been given 7 years ago and had never watched. And it was about the 43rd Wessex Division, and when I opened it, I discovered it had two videos in there. And one of them was of a 1965 three-part documentary about the 43rd Wessex Division. And it contained part of a talk by Horrocks about how he first met Monty on when he went out there to take over 30 Corps, and the briefing Monty gave him, and about the capture of Montpellier. And I thought it's absolutely fascinating. I thought I'll just see what's on this. And I watched it actually for the best part of 3 hours. So what I'm saying is, it is called The Wessex Wyverns. It was made, I think, by ITV, so one of the independent companies, and it was broadcast in 1965. I would recommend it wholeheartedly. I thought it was one of the best programs I've ever seen on the subject.
Wow, we'll have to search that one out. Yeah, no, Sheldrake is saying, after enough pints, Pegasi become real. Yeah, that's another one. Is the plural of Pegasus Pegasi? Because there was only one winged horse in mythology. So can you pluralize something that only existed once? Unicorns, theoretically, if they did exist in multiple numbers, whereas the Pegasus was just the one-off, I think. Someone will correct me on my Greek mythology there. It's a long time since I did Homer and Iliad and everything at school. But anyway, Christopher, it's been fantastic talking to you. As always, we'll do this again. Folks, I'm back with Jack tonight talking about tanks in Burma, so more armored warfare, but a different part of the world. As always, click like and subscribe. Buy my guest books. The links to Christopher's previous shows and some of his books in the description below. But I will see you all again later on. So cheers, everybody. Bye.
Bye.